Luxembourg has the highest GDP per capita in the world at over $120,000, more than double that of the United States. Yet despite this enormous wealth, you won't find people rushing to relocate there or praising it as a utopia. So why isn't everyone trying to move to the world's richest country? Today we're exploring the surprising reality behind GDP statistics and why economic metrics often fail to tell the full story of what makes a nation truly prosperous. Luxembourg's wealth is inflated by daily commuters. Over 200,000 workers from France, Germany, and Belgium contribute to its economy but aren't counted in its population. This artificially boosts its GDP per capita while masking the real challenges. High living costs, a competitive housing market, and social stratification make it less appealing than raw numbers suggest. GDP alone doesn't measure livability, equality, or opportunity, the true benchmarks of prosperity. Let's break it down. The U.S. ranks as the second largest welfare state in the world, yet 38 million Americans live in poverty. That disconnect reveals a fundamental flaw in how the system allocates resources. While the U.S. spends more overall on welfare than most developed nations, its targeted poverty spending as a percentage of GDP ranks 23rd among OECD countries. This means vast sums are flowing toward programs that don't directly help those who need it most. Much of this misdirection happens through tax-advantaged programs designed to benefit the middle and upper classes. Retirement plans like 401ks and mortgage interest deductions cost the government billions in lost revenue, money that could fund direct assistance. These programs function as welfare for the comfortable, but they're rarely framed that way. Someone claiming a $5,000 mortgage interest deduction receives the same fiscal benefit as a low-income family getting $5,000 through the Earned Income Tax Credit. The difference is visibility. One is a tax break, the other is branded as welfare. Take the mortgage interest deduction alone. It cost the federal government $25 billion in 2021, disproportionately benefiting households earning over $100,000. Meanwhile, programs like Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, TANF, Direct Cash Aid for the Poorest Families, received just $16 billion that same year. This prioritization of homeowner subsidies over direct poverty relief creates a system where the safety net is strongest for those who need it least. The inefficiency becomes stark when comparing the U.S. to countries with more targeted approaches. Denmark spends roughly 1.5% of GDP on programs specifically for low-income citizens, nearly double the U.S. rate. Finland channels 80% of its welfare spending toward the bottom 40% of earners. In the U.S., that figure is closer to 50%. This precision matters because when funds are diffused across broader income groups, less reaches those in crisis. Consider how this plays out in practice. A single parent working full-time at minimum wage earns $15,080 annually, below the federal poverty line for a two-person household. They might qualify for some housing assistance and food stamps, but they'll also compete with middle-class applicants for affordable housing units. Meanwhile, a family earning $150,000 benefits from tax-advantaged health savings accounts and retirement contributions, subsidies that dwarf what the working poor receive. The design incentivizes policymakers to expand programs with broad appeal rather than those targeting deep need. Subsidized retirement plans attract bipartisan support, while increases to food stamp budgets face opposition. Over decades, this imbalance reshapes the welfare state into a system where upper-middle-class families extract more value than the precariously housed. Landlords also exploit these gaps. In Milwaukee, housing voucher holders pay $55 more per month than market-rate tenants for equivalent units, a discrepancy that adds up to $3.6 million annually in overcharges. That money could house an additional 700 families if redirected. Instead, it flows to property owners who know voucher programs will pay above market rates. The result is a poverty machine. Funding gets diverted to tax breaks for the stable, while direct aid remains underfunded. Services meant to lift people out of hardship become profit centers for banks, landlords, and employers who pay poverty wages. Each layer extracts value before assistance reaches its intended recipients. What remains is a system that looks generous on paper, but fails its most vulnerable in practice. The U.S. dedicates enormous resources to welfare, just not the kind that reaches the poor efficiently. This isn't an accident. It's the natural outcome of structuring benefits around political expediency rather than human need. That misallocation reverberates into the next problem. Wages so low they keep workers trapped in poverty even with full-time jobs. If the safety net is patchy by design, the labor market often sabotages any chance of escape. 1 in 4 American workers holds a low-wage job, 3 times the rate in Italy or Japan. In the US, a low-wage job means earning less than 2/3 of the median full-time wage, which translates to about $16.50 per hour, or 34 euros annually. This definition matters because it shows how widespread substandard pay has become. By contrast, European nations use similar thresholds but have far fewer workers below them, just 5% in Italy and 10% in Japan. This disparity reveals systemic choices, not inevitable economics. A full-time minimum wage worker earns $15,080 annually, below the federal poverty line for most households. After accounting for rising housing, healthcare, and childcare costs, this wage covers just 65% of basic living expenses in the average U.S. county. 30 years ago, the federal minimum wage had 21% more purchasing power. While productivity grew nearly 62% since 1979, hourly pay for the bottom 90% of workers increased only 17%. Prices outpaced wages for essentials. Since 2000, rents rose 75%, while average wages grew 18%. Walmart exemplifies this dynamic. The company employs 1.6 million U.S. workers, the nation's largest private employer, while reporting $611 billion in 2021 revenue. A typical Walmart associate earns $27,136 annually, qualifying them for the Earned Income Tax Credit. In 2020, 25 million workers claimed the EITC, averaging $2,411 each, effectively a taxpayer subsidy for low-wage employers. One study found Walmart workers cost taxpayers $6.2 billion annually in public assistance. Corporations externalize labor costs by relying on safety net programs to bridge the gap between wages and survival. European systems prevent this through collective bargaining. In Denmark, 80% of workers are unionized, negotiating sector-wide wage floors. A Danish retail cashier earns $20 an hour with benefits. Their U.S. counterpart averages $12. Germany's collective agreements cover 54% of workers, setting regional minimums above poverty levels. These systems compress wage disparities. The ratio of Danish CEO pay to worker pay is 48.1 versus 320.1 in the U.S. Without such mechanisms, U.S. firms suppress wages knowing government programs will fill the void. The cycle becomes self-reinforcing. Low wages force workers to rely on subsidized housing and Medicaid, which then justifies keeping wages low. Employers treat $15 an hour as generous, ignoring that full-time work at that rate leaves a family of 4 below 150% of the poverty line. The Federal Reserve reports 37% of Americans couldn't cover a $400 emergency in 2021, a figure that includes 12% of workers earning over $100,000 annually. Precarious earnings create permanent instability. Policy choices enable this. The tipped minimum wage has been frozen at $2 since 1991, forcing servers to depend on volatile customer whims. 7 U.S. states still use the $7.25 federal minimum. Right-to-work laws in 27 states weaken unions by allowing workers to opt out of dues while benefiting from collective bargaining. These institutional barriers prevent wage growth despite record corporate profits. Wage theft exacerbates the problem. The Economic Policy Institute estimates employers steal $15 billion annually from workers through unpaid overtime, misclassification, and stolen tips. For low-wage workers, this averages 3,000 euros yearly, nearly 3 months' rent. Enforcement is minimal. The Department of Labor has fewer investigators now than in 1948, when the workforce was half its current size. The consequences ripple outward. Low-wage workers spend nearly all earnings immediately, stifling local economies. A Chicago Federal Reserve study found every $1 minimum wage increase generates $2,800 in annual consumer spending per worker. Contrary to fears, multiple studies show minimum wage hikes don't reduce employment. Seattle's $15 minimum saw food service employment grow 17% from 2015 to 2019. Young workers face particular hurdles. Despite higher education levels, millennials earn 20% less at age 30 than boomers did, while housing costs 39% more. Student debt, now averaging $37,000 per borrower, forces graduates to accept lower wages to service loans. This depresses wages sector-wide as employers needn't compete for desperate labor. These pressures converge in service sectors where automation threats constrain bargaining power. Fast food and retail workers face unpredictable scheduling. A Cornell study found 40% receive less than a week's notice for shifts. This volatility makes second jobs or education nearly impossible, locking workers into poverty. The system works precisely as designed. Wages stay low because power tilts toward employers. Safety net patches allow the illusion of functionality while obscuring the transfers, from taxpayers to corporations, workers to shareholders. Until that imbalance shifts, meager earnings will keep funneling into the next extraction point: housing markets rigged against tenants. In Milwaukee, families using housing vouchers pay an average of $55 more per month than market-rate tenants for comparable apartments, a 10% premium on $550, $600 rents. Research by sociologist Matthew Desmond found this overcharging costs taxpayers $3.6 million annually in one city alone, money that could house an additional 588 families if properly allocated. This discrepancy exposes how assistance designed to alleviate housing costs often enriches landlords instead. The housing voucher system emerged from lobbying by the National Association of Realtors, which pushed rent certificates over public housing projects. Their vision won out, but created unintended consequences. Landlords now treat vouchers as guaranteed income streams rather than incentives to improve properties. A Milwaukee landlord might receive $700 monthly from a voucher holder while charging $650 for an identical unit to someone paying cash. This happens because voucher programs lack strict price controls, allowing landlords to inflate rents knowing subsidies will cover the difference. Desmond's research shows this dynamic transfers wealth upward. Between 2000 and 2017, landlords' share of income from poor households grew from 50% to 70% as rents outpaced wages. A tenant working more hours to afford food sees their rent adjusted to absorb the extra earnings. The system effectively recaptures any financial progress through higher housing costs. Zoning laws worsen the imbalance. Single-family zoning covers 75% of residential land in major U.S. cities, blocking affordable multifamily developments. In Los Angeles, 78% of residential parcels permit only detached homes. These restrictions create artificial housing shortages that drive up rents. Developers bypass low-income projects when they can build luxury condos on the few eligible multifamily parcels. The result? Milwaukee has just 30 affordable units for every 100 extremely low-income renters. Compare this to Vienna's social housing model. The city owns or regulates 60% of its housing stock, with rents capped at 20 to 25% of household income. Construction gets funded through a 1% payroll tax and municipal bonds. Buildings remain mixed income, avoiding ghettoization. The average Viennese spends 22% of income on housing versus 34% for the average American. This stability stems from treating housing as infrastructure, not investment vehicles. U.S. landlords exploit voucher systems with minimal oversight. The Milwaukee Housing Authority found 82% of inspected voucher units had code violations, leaky roofs, broken heating, pest infestations. Yet landlords keep collecting inflated rents because tenants can't advocate for repairs without risking eviction. One landlord interviewed by Desmond owned 131 voucher units with repeated violations, netting $800,000 annually. The financial bleed compounds. Milwaukee's $3.6 million in voucher overcharges equals 8 full-time caseworkers' salaries. That money could provide 100 families with $3,000 emergency grants to avoid eviction. Instead, it flows to property owners who often reside in wealthier suburbs. Tenants see none of the value, just the stigma of Section 8 housing dogging their rental applications. Children bear the hidden costs. Students in unstable housing score 15% lower on standardized tests and change schools 2.3 times more frequently. Poor conditions increase asthma rates. Mold exposure alone accounts for 21% of U.S. childhood asthma cases. These impacts persist. Each forced move in childhood correlates with 7% lower adult earnings. Landlord profitability relies on this instability. Turnover allows rent hikes. 75% of Milwaukee evictions occur in units where landlords could clear 100+ more monthly with a new tenant. Courts enable this, processing evictions in minutes without reviewing housing conditions. One landlord admitted filing 120 evictions annually as part of the business model. The structural incentives are clear. Vouchers become profit centers rather than safety nets. Zoning protects landlords from competition. Courts prioritize property rights over habitability. Until these systems change, housing assistance will keep subsidizing substandard conditions instead of solving them. The next extraction point awaits in bank accounts, where fees target those with the least financial cushion. The banking system extracts the most from those who can least afford it. 9% of account holders pay 84% of all overdraft fees, people with an average balance of just $350s when the penalty hits. These are not occasional mistakes, but chronic burdens. A 2021 study found that the same small group of customers averaged 15 overdrafts per year, paying 450s in fees for what amounts to 250s in advances. Banks could decline transactions or warn customers, but they process purchases smallest to largest, an approach that maximizes overdrafts. Buy a $3 coffee before your $700 rent check clears, and you'll pay $35 for each subsequent small debit instead of one large fee. Overdraft fees generated $11 billion in revenue for banks in 2021, more than all robberies combined. The practice became lucrative after 2004 regulatory changes let banks automate overdraft programs. Before then, most institutions denied transactions that exceeded balances. Now they approve them for a fee, which disproportionately targets the financially unstable. Capital One and Ally have eliminated overdraft fees, but JP Chase still collects $1 billion annually from them. The typical offender earns less than $30,000 annually. Payday lenders employ similar extraction tactics. A $400 two-week loan carries $60 in fees, equivalent to a 400% APR. Borrowers often take 9 more loans to pay off the first, creating cycles where fees surpass principal. Lenders cluster in low-income neighborhoods. There are more payday outlets in the U.S. than McDonald's locations. Tennessee has 1,250 payday lenders, but only 840 ATMs. These businesses drain $8 billion yearly from communities through fees alone. Predatory targeting isn't new. In the mid-2000s, Wells Fargo pushed ghetto loans on black homeowners, high-interest subprime mortgages even for borrowers who qualified for prime rates. Internal documents referred to these as gold mines and silver mines. The average black victim lost $100,000 in home equity. Over 60% of Baltimore subprime borrowers could have qualified for conventional loans. These practices foreshadowed the 2008 crisis, yet banking executives faced no criminal charges. Fintech alternatives often exclude the poor. Cash App and Chime bill themselves as disruptors, but 30% of their users still report overdraft fees. Apps tout early payday access, but charge $8 to transfer wages 2 days sooner, a 300% APR equivalent. And digital banking requires smartphones and consistent internet, which 16% of low-income households lack. Prepaid debit cards come with hidden costs. Walmart's Money Card charges $5.94 monthly plus $3 ATM fees, $100 yearly for basic access. Superficial solutions abound. Credit unions offer small dollar loans at 28% APR, better than payday lenders, but still costly. The Postal Service proposed simple checking accounts in 2014, but banking lobbyists killed the plan. Even pandemic relief became an extraction opportunity. The Treasury sent 8 million COVID stimulus checks to expired prepaid cards, then let Green Dot and MetaBank charge $7.50 monthly inactivity fees on the balances. The math is relentless. A worker earning $15 an hour gets hit with $120 in overdraft fees while waiting for payday. That equals 8 hours of labor, an effective pay cut. 1 in 4 unbanked households avoids banks specifically due to fee concerns, relying on check cashers that take 2 to 3% per transaction. For someone making $25,000 annually, that's $500, $750s lost yearly just to access their own wages. Banking deserts compound the problem. Over 1,000 U.S. counties lack a single mainstream bank, leaving 12 million people dependent on predatory alternatives. Mississippi has 9 counties without any bank branches. Check cashing outlets and payday lenders fill the void, siphoning an estimated $3,000 annually from the average unbanked household. The system's architecture ensures profits flow upward. JP Chase generates more revenue from overdraft fees than from interest on all its small business loans combined. Payday lenders spend $5 million annually lobbying against interest rate caps. Market incentives align against reform. Why stop exploiting a customer base with no alternatives? Yet some communities are pivoting. Public banking initiatives in California and New Jersey propose local alternatives that reinvest fees into services rather than shareholder profits. Amsterdam launched a municipal bank in 2020 with no overdraft fees and free accounts for low-income residents, a model now spreading to other EU cities. These experiments show financial extraction isn't inevitable but engineered, and can be redesigned. The most radical resistance appears where you'd least expect it: tenants collectively buying their landlords out. When the 45-unit apartment building at 3350 Pillsbury Avenue in Minneapolis went up for sale in 2019, tenants faced a choice: risk displacement under a new landlord or buy the property themselves. They chose ownership, forming the Pillsbury House Cooperative through a process that reveals an alternative to exploitative housing markets. Resident-owned cooperatives now represent over 500,000 housing units nationwide. demonstrating that collective action can dismantle extraction-based systems. Eviction data shows why this matters. Traditional Minneapolis rentals experience 8.3 evictions per 100 units annually. Resident-owned buildings average 0.7, a 92% reduction. The stability comes from shared governance. Co-op members vote on budgets, repairs, and rent adjustments instead of facing unilateral decisions. At Pillsbury House, vacancies now average 5% compared to the neighborhood's 18% turnover rate, meaning children stay in the same schools and adults keep stable jobs. The acquisition followed a replicable model. Tenants first organized through the nonprofit Project for Pride in Living, which helped secure $450,000 in city affordable housing funds covering the down payment. A $3.2 million commercial mortgage covered the remaining 80%, with payments structured so no member pays more than 30% of income toward housing, a federal affordability benchmark rarely achieved in private markets. Closing costs included $25,000 for legal fees and $40,000 for immediate renovations deferred under previous ownership. Shared equity prevents speculative displacement. Unlike condos where owners profit from rising values, co-op bylaws limit resale prices to maintain affordability. A unit purchased for $8,000 in 1998 at another Minneapolis co-op would resell for $24,000 today, a 200% increase that adjusts for inflation without enabling windfalls. This contrasts sharply with market-rate units nearby, appreciating 300–400% over the same period. Wealth stays collective rather than enriching absentee landlords. Cost comparisons reveal systemic efficiencies. The average Pillsbury House member pays $950 monthly, including utilities, $350 below market rate for comparable units. Savings come from eliminated profit margins. Traditional landlords allocate 30–40% of rents to investor returns, while coops reinvest that money into maintenance reserves. After acquisition, Pillsbury House used $120,000 in accumulated equity to replace boilers and repair roofs, improvements the previous owner delayed for years. Scaling this model requires policy shifts. Minneapolis now allows cooperative ownership as a right of first refusal when subsidized buildings sell, but most cities lack such provisions. Expanding community land trust financing could help. The ground lease model used by New York's 2,300 coops reduces purchase prices by separating land costs. Federal backing akin to FHA mortgage insurance could lower commercial loan barriers. Currently, only 3 U.S. lenders specialize in cooperative housing mortgages. The potential national impact is measurable. Converting just 10% of the 5 million units currently receiving federal rental assistance to cooperative ownership would create $18 billion in collective equity for low-income households annually. That exceeds the combined market caps of major corporate landlords like Invitation Homes and Equity Residential. Savings would compound. Coop members spend 47% less on housing than traditional renters, freeing income for education or entrepreneurship. Pillsbury House's success reflects broader trends. In Washington, D.C., the 150-unit Brightwood Park Cooperative cut utility costs 30% through collective solar investments. Oakland's 96-unit Fruitvale Cooperative maintains 0 evictions since converting in 2013, despite surrounding rents doubling. These models prove housing can prioritize stability over extraction when residents control the underlying assets. The cooperative movement confronts one obstacle: startup capital. Minneapolis spent $23 million from its Affordable Housing Trust Fund to create 900 cooperative units since 2018, but that covers just 1.4% of the city's cost-burdened renters. However, every dollar invested captures long-term value. Coop buildings retain affordability for generations, rather than cycling back to speculative markets after 30-year subsidy periods expire. These cases prove what economic metrics miss. National GDP calculations ignore wealth retained in communities rather than extracted to Wall Street. Cooperatives trade short-term profit maximization for lasting stability, the kind that upgrades boilers before they fail and keeps children in their schools. This quiet revolution in ownership structures demonstrates prosperity isn't about income levels alone, but who controls essential resources. The next challenge is measuring progress by better standards. Norway consistently ranks among the world's happiest nations, despite having a GDP per capita 25% lower than the United States. This contradiction exposes the limitations of using GDP as the sole measure of prosperity. While the US ranks 8th in GDP per capita, it places just 27th in the Social Progress Index, a comprehensive measure of basic human needs, foundations of well-being, and opportunity. The SPI evaluates factors like safety, environmental quality, and access to education, none captured by GDP metrics. For example, an American earning $85,000 annually might still lack healthcare coverage, paid leave, or affordable childcare, issues that depress quality of life despite high incomes. Luxembourg's $143,742 GDP per capita masks extreme wealth concentration. The top 10% of earners capture 36% of national income, while 15% of residents live below the poverty line. Compare this to Norway, where oil revenues fund universal services rather than elite accumulation. Norwegian workers receive 49 weeks of parental leave at full pay, free university tuition, and guaranteed pensions worth 66% of former earnings. These systems explain why Norway's SPI score, 92.63, towers over the US, 80.96, despite Americans having larger paychecks on paper. Scandinavian models demonstrate how equitable distribution creates stability. Finland consistently leads the World Happiness Report by investing in mental health care. Therapist access per capita is triple the US rate. Green urban spaces, 90% of residents live within 300 meters of parks, and public libraries, circulating 18 items per capita annually versus 5 in the US. These investments yield measurable benefits. Finland's homicide rate is 1/5 of America's, while its life expectancy exceeds the US by 4 years. The correlation between social services and well-being becomes undeniable when comparing outcomes. The US underinvests in precisely the infrastructure that promotes social health. American cities allocate just 2.6% of municipal budgets to parks, half the European average. Public library funding has dropped 31% since 2000, with 25% of rural libraries lacking reliable internet. These cuts have consequences. Neighborhoods with robust parks and libraries show 15 to 20% lower rates of youth violence and depression. Yet Congress spends $800 billion annually on defense, enough to fund 40,000 new libraries every year. Priorities become clear when Finland spends 1.2% of GDP on defense and 7% on education, while the US flips those ratios, 3.5% defense, 2.5% education. Gross national happiness metrics reveal what GDP obscures. Bhutan's GNH index measures ecological diversity, mandating 60% forest coverage, cultural preservation, funding traditional arts, and community vitality, tracking volunteer rates. Portugal exemplifies how non-economic factors elevate well-being, ranking 5th in SPI despite its modest GDP per capita, $25,000. Its strengths include safety, 82% lower firearm deaths than the US, and environmental quality, 83% of urbanites live near green spaces. The contrast exposes America's misplaced focus. While the US debates tax cuts, Portugal guarantees 22 days of paid vacation plus 13 holidays annually. The data proves true. Prosperity requires systems that circulate rather than concentrate wealth. When Norway discovered oil, it created a sovereign wealth fund now worth $1.4 trillion to share resources across generations. Alaska's smaller permanent fund pays annual dividends averaging $1,600 per resident, direct redistribution missing from most U.S. energy booms. These examples show prosperity isn't about gross output, but what happens after. Luxembourg's glittering GDP means little if workers commute from France because they can't afford local rents, while Norwegian teens enjoy free university courses regardless of family wealth. The divergence appears starkest in mobility. Only 7.5% of Americans born in the bottom income quintile reach the top, half the rate of Denmark. Nordic countries achieve this through policies like Sweden's childcare caps, max 3% of income, and Finland's housing allowances, covering 80% of rent for low earners. The US, meanwhile, lets zoning laws inflate housing costs while college debts trap graduates in financial precarity. GDP grows under both models, but only one spreads the benefits. Alternative metrics already track these nuances. Switzerland's top-ranked Human Development Index score, 0.962, reflects free healthcare, vocational training programs, and low corruption, factors absent from GDP calculations. Ireland's booming GDP, second highest per capita, coexists with a homelessness crisis proving money alone doesn't build functioning societies. Ultimately, Norway's happiness lead over the US, despite lower GDP, proves what should be obvious. Life improves when nations prioritize people over abstract economic scores. The question isn't how much wealth a country has, but how many share in it. The true measure of a nation's wealth isn't its GDP, but how it supports its most vulnerable citizens. Current systems waste resources. For every dollar spent on poverty reduction, half gets lost maintaining inefficient bureaucracies or flowing to landlords and banks. Matthew Desmond's research shows the issue isn't lack of funding, but flawed allocation. Subsidies often enrich those already in power instead of lifting people from poverty. Norway proves prosperity comes from equitable distribution, not raw economic output. The path forward requires redesigning systems to prevent exploitation. Subscribe for our next exploration of how to rebuild these broken economic structures from the ground up.